topic is of great broad interest on emotions. Natalia is currently a clinical intern at the VA, and she got her PhD from Penn State, and her dissertation was on role of affect in daily life, latent profile analysis for daily diary data in substance abuse. And she's published a lot of very interesting papers on emotion dynamics in the day and different conditions, clinical disorders, populations, relationships to discrimination. And so very diverse and broad, but with a focus on measurement of emotions, which is partly what we'll get to hear about today. So welcome, Natalia. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure to be able to share with you today some of my recent work and thinking about measuring emotion using wearable technology and data-driven approaches. I'm just trying to multitask here to derive insights into well-being and health behaviors. So to start off, I think it's a really exciting time to be an affective scientist, someone who's interested in emotion research in this digital age. The technology and tools that we have today to measure emotion are quite different from what we've had in the past. And that brings a lot of opportunity as well as some challenges as well. I'm excited to share a bit more about that with you today. Specifically, our science of emotion until now has proceeded mostly from laboratory measures of emotion, whereas now we have many more diverse opportunities to capture emotion processes in daily life as it is lived, or emotions in the wild, whether that be vocal bursts captured through a smartphone recording, or using something like sentiment analysis to analyze text patterns of emotion from social media posts, or looking at emotions as expressed through emojis. So all of these different ways of looking at emotion. And today I'm going to talk about one aspect of my research program, which has to do with exploring some of these novel ways of capturing emotion in everyday life. In my work, I've done that mostly through using wearable technologies as someone who's particularly interested in physiological processes, as well as smartphones for EMA data or ecological momentary assessments, as many of us have. And finally, developing novel data-driven approaches to capturing emotion in everyday life and links to outcomes. Some of the outcomes of particular interest for me have been mental health and well-being, as well as emotions links to health behaviors. And that could be health risk behaviors like substance use, or health promoting behaviors like getting a good night's sleep, diet, or exercise. So today I'll be talking to you about two projects. The first has to do with emotional processes and links to well-being. And the second one has to do with emotion and health behaviors, specifically alcohol use. So my first project that I'll be presenting today was published in a special issue on emotion coherence in biological psychology, and presents a novel method for capturing coherence in daily life using wearable technology and ecological momentary assessments. So we know that emotion involves changes in subjective experience, physiology, and behavior. So in this case, this person might be feeling sad, given their sad facial expression. You might see along with that a deceleration in heart rate, as well as a subjective feeling of sadness or feeling blue. And many emotion theories postulate that emotions involve coordinated changes across these response channels of emotion, often termed emotion coherence or emotion response coherence. And today I'll be talking specifically about coherence between physiology and experience of emotion. To illustrate what that means a bit more, someone with high coherence on this top panel might look something like this, where their physiology, which is the pink line here, and their experience in the yellow line are tracking closely together over the course of an emotion episode. Whereas someone with lower coherence might look more like on this bottom panel here, where maybe their physiology is showing a lot more than they might be reporting. And that would be an instance of lower coherence. And coherence is typically associated with a functionalist perspective, suggesting that coherence might enable one to respond more quickly to contextual demands and is thought to be adaptive. But despite that theorizing, when I first got interested in this topic around 2014, there really was very little on outcomes associated with coherence, particularly in the realm of well-being, which I found surprising given all of these theoretical accounts suggesting that it should be associated with functional outcomes of adaptation. So one of my very first research projects was conducted in Bob Levinson's laboratory as a McNair Scholar at UC Berkeley to look at the relationship between emotion coherence and well-being. And we actually found that greater experience physiology coherence was linked to greater life satisfaction. And those findings were eventually published in Emotion, where we were able to demonstrate not only links to well being, but also lower ill being. So, lower depression, anxiety, as well as lower tendency to use maladaptive emotion regulation strategies like suppression. So that was really exciting. And since then, there have been several studies replicating and extending those findings on the adaptive function of emotion coherence, showing links to subjective well being. As well as physical health. And this was from a study on stress coherence, so coherence between subjective stress and stress physiology, as well as links to emotion regulation and greater body awareness. That was from an earlier study. However, all of these studies on emotion coherence had been conducted in a tightly controlled laboratory setting using experimentally induced emotion, leaving open the question of whether emotions cohere in everyday life outside of the laboratory context. So, in graduate school, I was interested in exploring this further to understand whether the coherence postulate generalizes to the daily life context, and if so, if coherence in that context is adaptive. In addition, we know less about the processes that contribute to coherence, and there is some evidence that coherence might be more likely at higher levels of arousal. So, some studies suggest that high arousal emotion conditions like fear exhibit higher coherence. And in that previous emotion paper I mentioned, we actually found that emotional intensity was linked to greater coherence regardless of valence. In addition, core affect theories suggest that individual differences in arousal focus or the degree to which one attends to the arousal dimension of affective experience is linked to greater interoceptive accuracy. So, building on this line of work, I propose that awareness of changes in physiology might be a necessary component of emotion coherence and sought to examine it in the daily life context. So in the present study, I use a combination of ambulatory physiology and ecological momentary assessments conducted over a month-long period to examine the extent to which experience in physiology showed coherence in daily life within persons. And then the second aim was to examine whether individual differences in coherence were associated with between person factors like well being, negative emotionality, and gender that have all been shown in laboratory studies to be important moderators of coherence. And I will just preface that secondary aim was more of an exploratory aim, given that as an initial test of those hypotheses, given that we were underpowered for the between person effects, though we were well powered for the within person effects in aim one. So in terms of the method, participants were 25 individuals aged 21 to 66, 84% white, who completed 28 days of ecological momentary assessments where they were pinged 6 times per day at semi-random intervals, and completion rates were high at 95%. In terms of our variables, we had self-reported arousal as well as ambulatory physiology and baseline assessments of well-being, negative emotionality, and gender. So again, at baseline, we collected demographics as well as the individual difference variables. which were assessed with the PERMA profiler, which is a multidimensional measure of well-being. Physiology was captured on a wrist-worn device continuously. We used the Empatica E4 to assess heart rate as well as electrodermal activity. And then self-reported arousal was reported 6 times per day in response to the question, how awake or active do you feel right now? Ranging from 0 to 100, and that was responded on a slider. So to analyze the data, I first pre-processed in R to filter out invalid physiology data, and then isolated the 1 minute of physiology preceding the EMA reports and took the arithmetic mean over that entire minute. And person mean centered the data so that we could see whether they were showing higher or lower than their average in terms of their physiology. And to assess coherence, I used this method borrowed from the Sommerfeld paper using Bayesian linear mixed effects modeling. So first, I specified the base models, and I have put the equations up here for those who might find them helpful. But if it's too much to digest, just know that we regress physiology onto self-reported arousal while accounting for including the by-person random intercepts and slopes. And second, added in the person-level predictors, namely well-being, negative emotionality, and gender, where the interaction term represents whether the level 2 variable, so the person level variable, moderates the association between the two level 1 variables, self-reported arousal and physiological arousal. So in terms of the results, we did find that self-reported arousal cohered with both heart rate and electrodermal activity. I'll just get those figures up for you to take a look at. So these are the line plots of the within-person associations between self-reported arousal on the y-axis and physiological arousal on the x-axis, where the solid blue line shows the prototypical positive association, and then the light gray line shows the extent of individual differences in coherence. So you can see a lot of variability there. I recall that 0, represents the individual's mean heart rate and self-reported arousal across all momentary occasions. Next, we sought to attribute that variation to and the extent of coherence to individual difference variables of well-being, negative emotionality, and gender, and found that coherence between heart rate and self-reported arousal was evident after accounting for those person-level predictors. There was a main effect of well-being on arousal, such that people with higher well-being had slightly greater levels of arousal on average, but no credible effects for well-being, negative emotionality, or gender on the strength of heart rate coherence. So there were no interaction effects indicating that any of those variables impacted coherence. And the same pattern of findings was true for electrodermal activity. So again, we found the evidence for EDA coherence between self-reported and physiology of arousal remained credible after accounting for those person-level predictors. Again, the main effect of well-being on arousal, but no credible effects for well-being, negative emotionality, or gender. So what can we take away from these findings? Across 28 days, findings suggest that physiology and self-reports of arousal that cohered, suggesting that coherence might be evident in these more ecologically valid settings, thereby extending coherence from the laboratory setting to the daily arena. However, there was substantial variability between persons. So though we had that average effect, you could see, that varied a lot by person. In this study, we could not attribute that variability to individual differences in well-being, negative emotionality, or gender. But do keep in mind the exploratory nature of those analyses, given our small sample size for the between-person effects, though we were well powered with 168 measurement occasion for within person effects. So I definitely would be interested in following this up with a larger sample to get a better test of those hypotheses. Um, in terms of future directions, our findings contribute to the literature by demonstrating a novel method for capturing coherence in daily life. And in future, I'd love to look at this with a more specific measure, such as stress. In this study, we looked at self-reported arousal, but in future, could look at self-reported stress and linking that to physiological indices of stress, and whether that type of coherence might be linked to well-being or health behaviors. I'm also interested in getting more context around what's going on for the person emotionally at the time of measurement. And one way that I thought of doing that was using the event marker. There's actually a button on the side of the empathic E4 that could be used to indicate, let's say, a stressful event that someone has throughout the day. And then we would know, where to look in terms of the physiology data to identify under what conditions might coherence in daily life be most adaptive. And then I'm also interested in exploring the mechanisms and moderators of coherence. We talked a little bit about potential moderators already, but in terms of mechanisms, I'm really interested in alexithymia, emotion labeling ability as a potential moderator, as well as things like interoceptive awareness and accuracy. And in terms of additional moderators, in this study, I did not have measures of disorder status, and do wonder if that could perhaps contribute to some of the variability, thinking about things like panic disorder or PTSD, where there might be disruptions in coherence, as well as how interoceptive beliefs might facilitate or interfere with coherence, like if someone interprets their body signals as dangerous, that might lead to someone reporting more maybe than their physiology is showing, for example. So the first study talked about wearable technology and EMA. And the second study will discuss using smartphones and data-driven approaches to modeling emotion and substance use in everyday life. And so this was actually from my dissertation project that was funded through a grant from the Research Society on Alcoholism. Got interested in this topic because as a clinical psychologist, I'm really excited about digital health interventions in terms of their potential to promote emotional well-being and health behaviors. And digital interventions includes things like mobile health apps, as well as just-in-time adaptive interventions, where just-in-time adaptive interventions are a specific type of mobile health intervention that is designed to provide personalized and timely support to help someone change their behaviors in daily life. So, for example, targeting someone at a time when they might be particularly vulnerable to smoking or binge eating. However, there currently exists a gap between our technological capacity that we now have to deliver these kinds of interventions on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ways in which we've built our models of health behaviors. Specifically, most of our current models used to guide interventions largely emphasize static relationships that change relatively slowly, like diagnostic status, or not at all, like past risk behaviors. Whereas in a just-in-time adaptive intervention, we're seeking to address dynamic risk factors that could change rapidly on the order of hours or even minutes, like mood, location, or social interactions. So focusing on dynamic risk factors could help us to build scientific models that can then inform the construction of a just-in-time adaptive intervention. And emotion and substance use is a case in point. So we know that emotion plays an important role in substance use, but what that role is less clear. So despite decades of theorizing about the role of negative affect, so for example, negative reinforcement models that suggest people use substances to alleviate or avoid negative affect, evidence for those models in daily life are elusive at best, especially for alcohol use. In a recent meta-analysis of 60 studies, including data from over 12,000 individuals, there was no relationship between negative affect and alcohol use in daily life, which is surprising. And to me, it's just one example of how our models of affect and alcohol use, or even other kinds of health behaviors, haven't really been built to facilitate these just in time adaptive interventions. If we were to rely upon trait models that suggest that things like depression, anxiety, stress, and other negative affect related variables are linked to alcohol use, we might decide to target someone at a time when they're feeling sad. But those relationships don't always bear out in daily life. And that got me thinking about, coming from an affective science background, how is it that we're measuring emotion? Because we know that emotions are more than just valence. They differ not only in terms of how positive and negative they are on the x-axis, but also in terms of their relative levels of activation or arousal on the y-axis here. So, taking anger as an example, anger is a negatively valenced emotion that has a relatively higher level of arousal compared to something like depression, for example, which would be lower in arousal. And that could be really important when thinking about the impacts of an emotion on behavior. So, think about positive emotions. When I feel excited, I might be likely to want to go out to a party. Um, when I feel calm, on the other hand, I might be more likely to want to stay home and meditate, have a cup of tea, read a book, something like that. And so when we aggregate across valence, we could actually miss out on important information in terms of how emotion might impact someone's behavior. So my argument here is that the valence-based approach, which is the one that's been taken in most of the substance use and even the health psychology literature more broadly, is limited in that it's one-dimensional and limits our knowledge of how affective components interact at the daily level. We also know that emotions co-occur in daily life. We can have mixed emotional states, such as when one is giving a talk, they might feel both anxious and excited at the same time. So we need ways of flexibly modeling that variation in daily life to identify what features of affective experience might matter most and in what combinations. One way of doing that is through latent profile analysis for daily diary data. So, latent class or latent profile analysis is a method to categorize individuals typically into unobserved classes or profiles based on a set of shared responses to a set of nominal, ordinal, or continuous observed variables. So, in the case of a categorical variable would be classes. In the case of a continuous variable would be profiles, but they're the same thing. And while multi-level latent class or latent profile analysis has been applied to account for nesting of students in classrooms as well as individuals in groups, there's been far less attention on applying this method to study psychological patterns in daily life. And this could be important in the case of emotion, given that we know that emotions rarely occur in isolation. So you can think about it like this. While traditional latent class analysis could answer the question, what kind of a person are you, emotionally speaking, based on a set of indicators, LPA for daily diary data could speak to the question of what kind of a day are you having, emotionally speaking. And then by linking that to an outcome variable, understanding how that then impacts one's behavior. So for my dissertation, I collected data from participants in the campus and surrounding community. Criteria were age 18-25, endorse engaging in simultaneous use of alcohol and marijuana at least once in the past month, as well as endorsed heavy episodic drinking as defined by 4+ drinks for women, 5+ for men on one or more occasions in the past 2 weeks. That resulted in a sample size of 154, majority women and majority white, mean age of 20.26. And participants gave 14 days of daily diary data, which resulted in 2,002 total days, about half of which included any substance use. Daily emotion was assessed with the PANIS short form, which includes 20 items that differ in terms of valence of positive or negative, arousal, so terms like alert or jittery, and discrete versus global terms. So guilt being a more discrete emotion, whereas upset is more of a global descriptor of a negative state. In response to the question, how do you feel right now? 1 to 5. And in terms of the outcome variables, they indicated whether or not they drank alcohol. So that was a yes, no binary variable, or used cannabis. And then if they indicated yes, they were asked a follow-up question about level of use. So number of drinks for alcohol and number of hits for cannabis. To prepare the data for analysis, I first lagged all the substance use variables to examine same-day associations between morning affect and evening substance use. Normalize the indicators using square root transformations for positive affect, as well as then transform the negative affect indicators to binary. And this is why they were highly skewed. In terms of the study aims, the first aim was to identify patterns of emotion at the level of occasion, so days in this case. To do that, I used a mixed indicator LPA of the 10 continuous and 10 binary affect indicators. And the second aim was to predict substance use from those patterns, which I did using LPA with a distal outcome using the BCH or 3-step approach. So to orient you to the results of this latent profile analysis, I'm just going to highlight the most important parts. So what I have here in the green column are the average levels of emotion. Recall that positive emotions ranges from 1 to 5 and are on the top. And then the negative emotions are on the bottom and range from 0 to 1 because they were binary. So the this indicates sort of the average level of positive emotion or average probability of experiencing negative emotion on the bottom. So you can compare the profiles to those averages. So the results of the latent profile analysis suggested a 5-profile model was best matched to the sample, and each profile was labeled according to its defining characteristics. So the first profile was termed undifferentiated negative affect days, and a typical day in this profile was characterized by higher than average level probability of experiencing most negative emotions, that's in the dark blue shading, as well as lower than average levels of positive emotion, which is the light blue shading. And the prevalence across all 2002 data records was 14% of the days. The next profile was undifferentiated positive affect days, which was characterized by the opposite pattern. So higher than average levels of positive affect in the dark shading and lower than average probability of negative affect, and the prevalence was 20%. Next, a typical day in the high arousal positive days profile was characterized by higher than average levels of excitement, feeling strong and enthusiastic, as well as lower than average probabilities of experiencing the negative emotion indicators, and that was 25% prevalence across all days. Next, mixed emotion days was high on all emotion indicators, higher than average on all. And low reactivity days was characterized by the opposite pattern, so lower than average on all emotion indicators. Next, I'll walk you through how these profiles differed in terms of their probability and level of alcohol and cannabis use. So first, the undifferentiated positive affect days and high arousal positive affect days were associated with significantly greater probability of any alcohol use compared to the reference profile, which was in this case negative affect days. In addition, the high arousal positive affect days were associated with significantly greater alcohol use compared to the reference profile. And there were no findings for cannabis use. So in terms of the takeaways, a multi-level latent profile analysis applied to the level of occasions, so days in this case, but could be moments in an EMA and future, could provide novel insights into proximal risk factors for health behaviors. In this study, I found that the day level structure of affect varied across days in terms of the positive and negative affect relations, as well as valence and arousal combinations, and that those patterns were meaningfully linked to alcohol use, such that positive affect in the absence of negative affect might be particularly risky for alcohol use. And in particular, high arousal positive states had stronger associations with greater levels of use when in combination with low negative affect. And so I find this fascinating because I think that we typically think of positive emotion as being associated with good outcomes. And it's an important reminder of the processes that might be at play when it comes to particularly high arousal states regarding impulsivity or reward, tendency to seek for hedonic rewards in those particular states. At the same time, I think it's important to remember in terms of the implications, we don't necessarily want to reduce people's positive affect, but maybe think about the ways in which people respond to those states. In terms of future directions, in this base model, I just had the emotion indicators, but in future, we could build on this model to add things like location or context, whether they're social or solitary, etc., to build more nuanced models of dynamic risk factors that could inform just-in-time interventions, as well as the inclusion of passively sensed emotion indicators like arousal from that other study. Even at present, these findings could be used to inform personalized intervention approaches, such as delivering a text message about risk based on their morning affect and providing them with a protective behavioral strategy if they do plan to drink that evening, or even providing an alternate suggested activity. In addition to applying this method to daily processes, I'm also interested in the possibility of applying a similar method to understand patterns of health behaviors in everyday life. So, again, kind of coming back to the traditional latent class model would be grouping people into different groups. So, in this case, based on their health behaviors, if you have exercise, sleep, and healthy eating, maybe the red people are the good exercisers, the orange people might be your good sleepers, the green people are eating lots of vegetables, and then the two purple groups might be some combination of those things. And then we could look at their health outcomes over time. So that would be one way of applying a regular latent class analysis. But on a day-to-day basis, we're faced with making these decisions about what kinds of behaviors we are going to engage with. So for me personally, in the new year, it's been, do I sleep an extra hour or do I get up early and exercise? And that varies from day to day. And so could we use a method like this, for example, to capture behavior patterns in daily life across these different health behaviors to understand what kinds of patterns might be most associated with better health and well-being outcomes in the longer term? So just some ideas I had in terms of how to extend this model in future. In terms of broader future directions, if I were so fortunate to have the opportunity to collaborate with some of the wonderful group here, I would substantively be interested in extending my work on emotion and well-being to understand how interoceptive processes impact well-being and mental health. I spoke a little bit already about coherence, but also interested in other types of processes like interoceptive beliefs. In addition, moving beyond sort of that individual lens to understand how social determinants of health impact emotional processes and well-being outcomes. And I have some work on that already that I wasn't able to present today, but very interested in race-related stress as well as socioeconomic status and other social determinants. Finally, as a clinical psychologist, I'm always interested in how we can intervene to promote well-being. I'm particularly interested in mindfulness-based approaches as well as digital health interventions. And then in terms of health behaviors, I'm interested in expanding not only from substance use, but to including other kinds of health behaviors like sleep, diet, and exercise to understand how discrete positive emotions might impact health behaviors. So kind of building on the distinctions in terms of arousal Is it possible that maybe lower arousal states like gratitude, those that could be fostered through mindfulness-based interventions, might be really beneficial, but is maybe the links between higher arousal emotions might be more variable? Secondly, how do the emotions that we want to feel impact our engagement with health behaviors? And I'm interested in that not only from an emotion regulation goals perspective, but also affect valuation perspective. So, what are the emotions that we value, that we would ideally like to feel, and how does that impact? If someone values high arousal positive states, for example, are they going to be more likely to reach for stimulant drugs? Oh, sorry. And then finally, how does affective forecasting could that increase or decrease engagement with a health behavior, as well as the time course of how we think about those things? So I went on a run this morning. I thought about how good I'm going to feel after that run, and that motivates me to do that behavior. Whereas if I were to think about how challenging or how much negative emotion I might feel during that run, it might not be as motivating. So those are just some ideas. And then coming back to the methods aspect, I'm interested in continuing to explore new wearable devices, such as the Aura Ring. I'm very interested in terms of smartphones, as in some of the work going on here, using the sensors on the smartphone to measure heart rate. And then in terms of data-driven approaches, interested in using predictive machine learning algorithms to capture emotion states in daily life, as well as using things like digital phenotyping to inform personalized medicine, personalized intervention approaches. And with that, I will thank you all for your kind attention, and would like to thank all of my wonderful mentors and co-authors, funding sources, and have left my contact information here. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Excellent job. So good. Everyone's clapping, but they're muted. So.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I mean, we definitely have time for some questions. Alyssa had to jump off a little bit early, so she's going to meet with you later today. And she had lots of questions, and she was all jazzed up about in the chat. But yeah, okay. We have one right here. Yeah, Kai.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Van Doren. This is for sharing this really impressive body of work with us. And from a lifespan perspective, we're really interested in intervening to promote longer health spans. And one of the things that I was excited about, that I was wondering if you can elaborate on a little bit more, is the option to not just classify and predict people's emotional profiles or based on their days, but still relying on the pooled data to create those latent classes, but rather using a person's own data and classes within their own data to predict their specific patterns of substance use, and even more so of substance abuse. And so I was wondering if you were going into that direction of going further deeper into the individual.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that comment. And that is, in fact, a future direction that I'm currently working on. I had a wonderful committee, including some quantitative psychologists through Penn State, Bethany Bray, who's now at University of Illinois, Chicago. So she had moved. But we are working on adding in the person level, which I agree is really important. So in this study, what Yochai is referring to is that we were looking more at the occasion level, without necessarily considering that person's particular emotion profile, which could be looked at in different ways. Could be looked at both at the baseline, what is their typical emotion pattern, and then deviations from that on a day-to-day level. And so methodologically, when I started my dissertation, nothing like this had ever really been done before. So I was fortunate to be able to kind of figure out the methods in collaboration with my methods committee members. So this was sort of step one to that, is can we do the sort of multi-level aspect, days nested within persons. But then the next step, of course, would be exactly as you mentioned, bringing in that person level more, which I think is really interesting and, could provide a lot of rich opportunity for prediction. And even, I was even thinking about at the baseline level, what someone's base pattern is, how that could impact what kinds of emotion states would then lead to use. In this study, we didn't have like measures of depression or anxiety, which I think would be really interesting to look at in future. It is also a sample of people, college students who binge drink, which might tend to be higher on positive affect in general. And so that's an important caveat and limitation on our findings as well, to think about how these emotions patterns might play out differently across the lifespan, as well as in different populations in terms of some of the baseline variables that we have. But definitely it's a future action that I'm actively working on, and there's some statistical things to be worked out with that, that I'm really excited to be a part of. And yeah, really appreciate the comment. Thank you.
Wendy.
Yeah, Natalia, thank you so much. Just fantastic work, fascinating. I could see all the influences of Bob Levinson and Penn, and right, it's just terrific work. I want to go back to that first study on coherence in daily life and just help think with you on your question that you asked, that you was the subjective experience that you correlated with physiologic responses, was how awake, aroused are you? So first, it's like, it could be affective, but that also could be non-affective arousal, right?
Yeah.
I exercise, I may or may not have a strong affective experience, but arousal is, yes, it's a dimension of the circumplex model, but in itself, it's not affect. So,
Yeah.
and by the way, I actually think the fact that you did that, I do think that's closer to the coherence idea, right? Like with arousal and heart rate, because heart rate, what is it getting you? It's not really getting you, obviously, valence. It's probably getting you just strict arousal responses. So if I gave you a shot of epinephrine, right? How aroused are you? So my first question is like almost like a bigger question of like, is that what why is that affect? And then if you could do the next study that you proposed with stress coherence, what would that subjective experience be? And what physiologic response would you want to correlate it with?
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. And all of those are important issues that we do discuss in further depth in the paper. And so in that paper, we talk about this as sort of a first step to being able to measure coherence in daily life. And apologies if that wasn't coming across as well in the talk format, which is more brief. But you're absolutely right. Arousal is only one dimension of emotional experience. We actually had some valence data. However, analytically, it's tricky to think about we couldn't ultimately figure out, and I did have a great team working with me. Zita Oravex is a quantitative psychologist who specializes in Bayesian methods. And we actually have a follow-up study using the circumplex model on an app that was developed by the team to indicate, just pushing in the app where you land in the circumplex model. So I'll be very interested to see how those findings come out. And so what I was trying to convey with my in the introduction sort of portion is some of the processes that might be at play in coherence. So this sort of arousal coherence construct could speak, not to an emotion episode as would be traditionally defined, the definition of coherence, but instead something like, in some indication of interoceptive awareness,
Okay.
something, I also in terms of like arousal focus. Part of my inspiration for this project was looking at some of Lisa Feldman Barrett's earlier papers circa like 2003, 2004 on valence and arousal focus. And when you think about why coherence might be adaptive, that would be, to me, one of the reasons is if you're more aware of your physiological states, can pick up on those. And then adding to that, something like emotion labeling ability could, create coherence between physiology and experience of emotion, ultimately speaking. And I do think that in future, using a more specific subjective experience rather than just arousal and looking at, had we had something like stress or even a more specific emotion like anger ratings, depression, etc., and correlating that with, I would probably go with the same indices, given that, heart rate, for example, is linked to, we would expect it to go up in stress episodes or anger episodes, sort of more high arousal states, or even with depression, going, that's less specific. But different questions to be worked out in terms of how to pursue that further. So yeah, I think that's an important caveat. I appreciate you bringing that up as a certainly a limitation of the present study, and something I would hope to continue working on going forward. I actually remember when I started this project, I did reach out to Bob Levinson, as I sometimes do when I have an idea, and he was like, that would be really cool.
Yeah.
And it's not coherence as traditionally defined,
Yeah.
but I still think you should do it. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
good.
it seems like it fit in this funny like midpoint between like a type of daily experience of interoceptive awareness and
Yeah.
coherence. Like it is novel, and I think you're getting something different out of those two different ways to think about how the body and the mind are associated. But so I just and I want to leave time for other people to ask questions, but I did want to tell you we published a paper with mindfulness-based interventions with Jennifer Daubenmeier as the first author, and we found that a mindfulness-based stress intervention resulted in less association between subjective states and physiologic responses, which I thought was fascinating, right? Because you could think that the intuition would be, as people are becoming more sort of aware of their internal states, that they would show stronger associations between subjective reports and their physiologic reactivity. And we found that the intervention created more of a disconnect. And it was fascinating. I'll send you the paper because I think there's something really interesting there about, taking a different level of, this is where I'm going to get the information about how I'm reporting my emotional experience. That's not only bottom up. Anyway, sorry, it's a long answer to, but I think the direction that you're going is fascinating.
I love that. Thank you. And I'd love to take a look at that paper. Yeah. Actually, I think it brings up an important point too about, is coherence adaptive and under what conditions? And it is an open question because, on the one hand, I think coherence like during reactivity could be helpful, but then, if you're trying to regulate, ultimately you would probably hope to see lower coherence as you're, trying to regulate. So anyway, thank you.
Anybody else? No?
I had a question. I thought it was a great talk. It was really interesting. And I sort of to follow up on some of Wendy's comments, I was wondering about your first project, looking at this sort of coherence idea, and one of your future directions was to look at the context, the daily context in which this might be more beneficial than other contexts. And I was also just kind of wondering about coherence in the sense of how connected you are, or how much in sync you are with other people around you. And I was wondering how feasible it might be to use some of these wearables and try to collect, it could be both physiological data and self-report data, and to try to map that onto those who you're near, and to see, does that type of coherence also, is that sort of beneficial, and does that also connect with the type of coherence that you were talking about?
Yeah, I think those are all really fascinating ideas, and certainly Dr. Mendes, and I'm sure others in this room would be more of the expert on sort of that dyadic physiological linkage that could occur. One thought that I had with that is a project I'm a part of at Penn State with Tim Brick, who I'm trying to think of he was at the Max Planck Institute and now is at Penn State, and a really interesting emotion and like digital health guy. But we had been talking about, he has a project going on that captures vocal bursts. So I mentioned vocal bursts of, it captures emotion that way as a way of understanding what other people's emotions are. Because I'm just thinking about, unless you have, maybe you could have couples wearing the wearable devices and then do something like that within a couple dyad, or even like parent-child dyad, and that would be really cool. Someone who you're likely to be around, or who could influence your emotion in a significant way. But if it's just sort of more general, I also had thought about, in that study that's ongoing, and has to do with sort of validating the method for capturing emotion through vocal bursts, but they are wearing the Empatica E4 in some conditions, and then also the Aura ring and others to capture physiology. And that's captured through smartphone in terms of vocal bursts. So maybe that could be a way of looking at, your physiology in relation to someone's affect as expressed through vocal bursts. But really love the ideas about, potentially getting dyads or couples to wear, wear some Empatica E4s or something like that, and then looking at like using the marker for like, we're having an argument right now, and looking at how the back and forth. I think that would be really fascinating.
Great, thanks for sharing.
Yep.
Well, that is time. That was amazing. Great job. We really appreciate you spending time with us, and I'm so thankful to so many of you that joined. We recorded this. If you're okay with it, Natalia, we have a channel. It's a widely viewed channel of talks, and so well, widely viewed, I don't know, but we have a channel, I've heard. And so if we can edit this up and put it up, if you're okay with that, we'd love to do that, so that more people can see your work. And Alyssa, will see you later today. And amazing job. Thank you so much.
Thank you
And
so
thank you
much
so
for
much for
having me.
joining. Yeah,
Really appreciate
everybody.
it.
Absolutely. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
All right. Bye, guys.